Well, after all, Blizzard had announced this. They said that they were going to do this to land another round of balance tuning before the release of the full season, so Mythic Plus and Mythic Raiding. Now, the only question was on whether or not this was going to be announced on Friday, before the weekend, or on Monday, after the weekend. I guess now we have our answer. Now, since the numbers, since the amount of the buffs or nerfs given to the specs have already been calculated, it's time to get into this and check exactly how many of the specs have been affected and for how much, and in some cases even on whether or not this is relevant. For example, if we start with Death Knight, you have the buffs given to Sunlane. But there's the thing, Sunlane gets a buff to Vampiric Strike chance to trigger, plus the Frenzied Bloodthirst damage of Death Call and Death Strike, and also more strength from Visceral Strength, which positively brings Sunlane to break the 1.4 million barrier in these simulations. But here's the thing, it's still weaker than Rider of the Apocalypse build. So it is roughly a 3.5% damage buff given to Sunlane overall, which makes it closer to Rider, but still not quite as much as being viable when it comes to, in particular, single target. Things don't really get that much better when you look at the results in a pseudo Mythic Plus situation where Rider is even further ahead than Sunlane. So for the first set of changes given to Unholy, we're not talking about something drastic. Where we get a few more drastic changes definitely is with Balance. Because Balance Druid gets a flat out 6% damage increase, plus the 16% damage increase of Star Surge, plus the 20% damage increase to Starfall, plus an extra buff to Eluna's Chosen, further increasing the extra damage of Starfire on single target, now up to 80% from 65%. This was necessary because prior to these buffs, you can see that Keeper of the Grove was significantly ahead of Eluna's Chosen, not to mention both of them were quite terrible. If you were to look at the actual, results of damage, Balance Druid was not having too much of a good time. So the buff get to be quite relevant, because if you look at the situation with Eluna's Chosen and their type of damage, getting Star Surge buffed as well as Starfire buffed by a significant amount can end up being a pretty good buff overall, which it was, because Balance Druid's buff is 9.4% for Keeper of the Grove and over 12% damage buff increase for Eluna's Chosen. So now, as you can see, the difference between the two is much closer. And also now Balance Druid is no longer nearly as terrible. With a 1.4 million sim, they would no longer be in the bottom 3 or bottom 4, they would be slightly further up, which is an improvement. Of course, that still keeps you in the bottom third in terms of single target damage. Now, if we have to find a positive, is that with this, getting buffed has also significantly improved your AoE damage as well. If we were to trust the wonkiest of the APLs so far, the Balance Druid one, their AoE damage has also increased significantly compared to before. They jumped up by quite a large amount in their AoE damage, or they will jump up as soon as these changes go live. So perhaps a bittersweet change when it comes to single target, because you're not really any good now, but in AoE you might have quite some more value compared to now. The next set of changes is still with Druid, this time with Feral. On top of the 3% damage increase, you also get a damage increase to Rip, Ferocious Bite, Feral Frenzy, and then a 3% damage of Ravage for Druid of the Claw. Now, once the calculations are fully done, they should be a little above a 4% damage increase for Feral Druid, so they should be able to start to get close to breaking the 1.4 million barrier of single target DPS. Which is still not too great. Even with this buff, Feral Druid would not be in too good of a position. Also, sadly enough, after this much larger buff to Balance, Feral has gone back to being the worst of the two. We started the beta in quite a positive situation for Feral, especially above Balance Druid, but now, after the buffs, the much larger buffs given to Balance, not nearly as much. Now, some more hope for all of the augmentation haters, because Devastation gets a 10% buff to Disintegrate and a 10% buff to Eternity Surge. So two of the main abilities of Devastation, especially Disintegrate. As you know, in some situations, especially in single target, Devastation gets to be a little bit repetitive with their casts of Disintegrate, and as a result with their damage of Disintegrate nearly half of their damage. So obviously if half your damage gets buffed by 10%, it's not too hard to understand why Devastation gets overall above a 5% damage increase. It's a 6% buff for Scale Commander and over 7% buff for Flame Shaper. So we're not talking about barely breaking the 1.4 million barrier here. Now Devastation is getting close to the 1.6 million barrier. And at the moment, pending any more tuning we haven't heard of yet, they would have the theoretically, second highest DPS overall, right behind Enhancement, or third highest or close to Arcane Mage at the moment. So, as I said, positive for the augmentation haters, because the more Devastation gets buffed, the better it is. This, of course, is not nearly as, good in AoE, specifically mostly due to your AoE damage coming from more than just Disintegrate sources. So if we were to take, for example, some 8 target burst window of a Devastation Evoker, you will find that you get nowhere near the 50% damage coming from your Disintegrate, of course, so you don't get nearly as big of a buff when it comes to AoE damage. But for single target, it is still definitely a very good buff for Evoker. Talking about being very good, what we don't have is Arcane, which gets nerfed. Meteorite damage of Sun Fury plus the bonus increase of Burden of Power is now down to 20% instead of 30%. So this was the old Arcane that we mentioned, being one of the highest at almost 1.6 million. After this nerf, it's a 1.7-ish% nerf, bringing them some 20k DPS lower down. We are still talking about one of the specs in the 1.5 range and one of the top 5 or so, 3 to 4 to 5 single target DPS specs, so that is still a very good position for Arcane. As mentioned, they don't have nearly as good of a position when it comes to Mythic Plus in terms of their AoE damage profile. Arcane is not very good at hitting many targets. If you're looking, similar to Devastation, at their large many targets AoE when playing their Sun Fury build, they don't have as easy of a way to hitting 8 targets compared to many other specs. So while their single target is very good, it's premier right now, S tier, not nearly as much their AoE, which also is not receiving any particular buffs at the moment. Talking about receiving particular buffs at the moment, you have Fire Mage. Fire Mage gets a 6% damage buff overall, plus a 25% damage buff to Living Bomb. So they get a 6% damage buff, because Living Bomb doesn't exist right now. The results are pretty good. This was the old Fire Mage not having too good of a time, we can say. In fact, we can say it was the worst of the performing specs, only beating Keeper of the Grove of Balanced Druid, except the Balanced Druid now gets buffed. So with this 6% damage increase, it's going to be roughly overall a 5.5-ish% damage increase, which definitely helps Fire Mage gets away from the bottom of the performers, breaking also the 1.4 million barrier, like many of the specs we have already mentioned. So now it's a much more okay spec. The only problem is that within their class, they are still significantly worse than the other two. That is perhaps the only negative of Fire. It is good still that when you move over to AoE, for example, their damage is much more competitive compared to the rest of their class, for one, and a few of the other specs as well. So they might have better luck being tried out in AoE situations than still pure single target fights, where even after these buffs, they are not particularly strong. After Fire, we have the changes to Windwalker. Now, the results of this change are very simple. Now you just swap away from this talent altogether, from Darting Hurricane, and you move, generally speaking, to Transfer the Power. So due to the loss of this talent, it's roughly also a 1.6-1.7% nerf. They're still well above 1.5 million. At the moment, there is still the worry of the spec itself slightly over simming. so there might be that danger around the corner for Windwalker as well, but it's not too big of an impactful change for the spec. We also have a big change for Shadow. At this point, we are starting to see a trend. It's another one of the pre-changes spec well below the 1.4 million DPS checkmark. Well, they get buffed by 6%, as well as a very slight AoE nerf to the spreading AoE damage of Psychic Link, now spreading 25% of your single target damage instead of 30%, so it doesn't make this buff be nearly as much as 6% in AoE. But when it comes to single target, they do move almost, very almost close up to the 1.4 million checkpoint that Blizzard seems to be wanting to bring all of the specs. As mentioned though, even if you get to that checkpoint, you're still quite weak compared to many of the other specs, now close at to or above the 1.5 million checkpoint. Since at the moment we have 11 of the DPS specs close to or above the 1.5 million. So congrats, you got to 1.4, you're still in almost the bottom half of the results at the moment. And so is Shadow Priest. After them, we have nerfs to Outlaw. Outlaw is one of the specs you also have been seeing in these early heroic results performing very well. The nerfs are nerfing all of the ability damage by 4% plus dispatch damage plus melee auto attack damage, but buffing the tier set. Now, why would Blizzard be buffing this tier set as a compensation? The reason for that is that because before all of these changes, Outlaw does have the, by quite a good margin, worst tier set in the game. You know, it's pretty funny to see these 16, 12, 9, 9% damage increases, and then you have a 1.3% damage increase for Outlaw. So what this does is it does nerf, actually, Outlaw Rogue by barely 2%, so they go closer down to the middle of the 1.5 million results, which is still good, it's still a solid result, but in exchange they at least now get a much healthier, much more average tier set. That is the change that is happening to Outlaw, which was performing very well. And as we are talking about very good performers, we have another change to Enhancement, which was another one of the good performers. Now, they get the reverse treatment than Outlaw, because they start being buffed, they get a 4% damage buff, and they get the 2-piece set bonus, which was nerfed literally a few days ago, and we all wondered why it was being nerfed when the 2-piece of Enhancement Shaman was a whooping 0.6% after they nerfed it. It gets buffed again. However, one of their, or possibly their strongest talent in the game for them, Witch Doctor's Ancestry, and also this entire line of talents, this gets nerfed, because now the cooldown reduction you get on your Feral Spirits is 1 second per Maelstrom weapon stack instead of 2. This nerfs your generation of dogs by almost 50%, close to around 40%. So if you were casting 20 dogs in a fight before, now you get to cast about 12. This is very dangerous for Enhancement because the Feral Spirits already give you generation of Maelstrom weapon, 1 stack every 3 seconds. And on top of that, when you talent into Elemental Spirits, the more of them you have out, the more 20% damage increases you get to your element types, fire, frost, or lightning, which is a very big damage scaler for Enhancement. And after discovering the hybrid storm build skyrocketing their damage, the only spec even close to breaking the 1.7 million barrier with still an obscenely powerful tier set, now that the spawn rate of the wolves is significantly reduced, the result is that now your tier set has gone down to almost half of the damage. That still makes it one of the best 5, top 5 strongest tier sets, but the damage to your performance has been done. Now you get nerfed by above 10% to your strongest build. Now, the positive of being nerfed is that this is very heavily hurting this build in particular, which means you are going back to having the traditional build of Elementalist Stormbringer Enhancement now being much more close and competitive, and considering the complexity of this build, it's very likely you will outperform it with the more straightforward Elementalist build. But even after this massive 10% nerf, Enhancement is still a pretty solid, a very solid DPS spec at the moment, especially in single target. The last of the meaningful DPS changes, we have yet to introduce it fully in our sims, but are the changes to Destruction, who gets a 6% damage buff given to the entire spec, and also an attempt at making Dimensional Rift as well as Channel Demon Fire playable spells, more playable spells, by buffing both of them in damage by 40%. Now at the moment, even if you were just to consider the 6% damage increase, they too would be getting to that 1.4 million damage checkmark. The same goes for the much smaller buff to Demo, who was already closer to that checkmark, and now they get buffed by giving them 20% more damage to Demon Bolt and also 15% more damage to your Felguard, which should be a bit above a 2% damage increase, further getting them close to that 1.4 million checkpoint. The other one of the small changes, these are even smaller though, are the ones to Warriors. Arms and Fury getting the Blade Storm damage nerfed by 10%. Fury also gets Odin's Fury nerfed by 10%. These are not, these are not major, even if we were to go, for example, especially in single target, Blade Storm has a much higher power in AoE. If we were to look, for example, at Slayer of Fury Warrior right now and look at the amount of damage these abilities are doing in single target, of course, you will find that in terms of damage done, Blade Storm between the main hand and the offhand damage is at about 10%, so this is a 1% damage nerf by nerfing Blade Storm for Fury Warrior, for example. So for both Arms and Fury would be a slight, some 20-ish K DPS damage reduced from this high 1.4 million simulations they have at the moment in single target. The damage nerf would be, of course, slightly more punishing when it comes to AoE. So when you go and look at the damage done by, for example, Fury in AoE, the damage of Bladestorm would be slightly higher, so the nerf in AoE would be slightly higher as well. We haven't touched on the healers yet, because of course there is not really much of any sims to be checking based on the healers. At the very best, you could be checking the healing results, but that's not really that indicative. You would find the 3% healing buff given to Mistweaver Monk, as well as the 8% healing done by Restoration Druid, plus 20% more damage to their Wrath, Starfire and Star Surge. Also, you have the 6% healing nerf to Holy Paladin. They do get their damage buffed because the damage of Holy Paladin is terrible. So you have Judgment, Crusader Strike and Hammer of Wrath being buffed significantly. Also an offset to Avenging Crusader, transferring much less of a percentile of damage compared to before because of these abilities being buffed, as well as some minor damage given to Restoration Shaman's damaging abilities. But as mentioned, this is not nearly as indicative of the performance of the healers. I mean, just yesterday we checked this and Restoration Shaman was all over here and Preservation was here and Discipline was lower down, so it's already swapping around. We will see eventually how this will turn out for healers as well. But for today, this was the long recap of all of the expected changes given to the tuning coming in the next reset. Of course, you could have checked out these updated results by the minute that were done on the spreadsheet. The link will be in the description, but as always, you can hop over on the Discord to find all of the latest updated news and info related to this expansion. If you want some of these infos even faster, or even get some previews and early access to the upcoming videos, you can go over and visit my Patreon to empty your wallet. And with these PSAs out of the way, we are now leaving each other. We are starting, of course, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for watching the video, but also for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, come on. It was cloudy and chill and very nice yesterday. Why is it hot now? Why do I have to take my long pants off? They were comfy.